This presentation, and the next, will investigate one of the more curious unsolved crimes in American history. Indeed, it is a crime so mysterious that most people do not even recognize it as a crime. The incident involves the mysterious disappearance of roughly 1/4 of the entire American economy and the theft of the entire U.S. supply of money. That's right, all of it. It also entails a massive counterfeiting operation intended to hide the crime and an attempted frame-up to throw would-be investigators off the trail of the real perpetrators. We call this crime the Great Depression. The Great Depression began in 1929, but it was not a single one-time event. It spanned over a decade and it happened before. It has happened since. The crime has gone by different names as well. Prior to the incident in question, the crime was called a panic, and since then the crime has often been called a recession. The most notable panics in U.S. history prior to 1929 occurred in 1785, 1792, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1907, and 1920. Since the Depression, we have had recessions in 1949, 1953, 1958, 1960, 1973, 1980, 1991, 2001, and 2007. Historians and economists disagree over which of these events should count as a genuine recession, and indeed, there's no general agreement even as to what defines a recession. What we do know is that each time this crime has occurred, money suddenly disappears, businesses that relied on the money fail, and all the people who work at those businesses lose their jobs. What follows is a period of economic misery for those who lost their money and jobs, and a painful period of rebuilding all that was lost. We'll investigate the 1929 to 1945 recession, since it is the most severe and the most prolonged in U.S. history. If we can solve this mystery, it will lead us to better understand and solve the others. The victims of this crime are pretty easy to identify. Roughly 1/4 of the American workforce was thrown out of work. Millions of them lost their entire bank accounts or saw their entire investment portfolios wiped out. The unemployment rate went from roughly 2% in 1929 to 24% in 1933. The value of stock, or the shares owned in America's corporations, fell by more than a third, and the supply of money contracted by a similar amount as banks closed and with them went people's bank accounts. Millions lost just about everything they had, as their mortgaged houses and farms were taken away from them when they could no longer make payments on their loans. Many historians and even some economists blame the Great Depression on speculators, who placed reckless bets on unstable markets. Many even blame the free market economic system itself, arguing that there must be something wrong with letting people trade freely and make agreements with one another without the government and there to tax and regulate them. But how can this be? People take risks all the time, and such risk-taking is essential if the economy is to progress at all. Every investor or entrepreneur takes risks when they decide to invest in a business or open a business. They try to anticipate what consumers will want, and then they try to provide it for them in the most efficient manner possible. If I'm correct in my assumptions and skilled in the manner that I act on my assumptions, I make a big profit. If I'm wrong or unskilled, I lose. This is how a free market separates the winners from the losers and thereby ensures that economic resources are placed in the hands of the most capable people. The free market will not permit valuable resources to be wasted by being left in the hands of the incompetent. Blaming investors or entrepreneurs or finding fault with the market itself is to convict innocent parties. We'd be letting the real culprits get away with a crime. As is often the case in these kinds of crimes, the real criminals have taken great pains to cover their tracks and cast blame away from themselves. While our attention was focused on some highly visible wealthy people, was there something good going on behind the scenes? Were things being manipulated by people far less visible or obvious? If one looks deep enough and thinks hard enough, one can find the root cause of things. First, we must ask, what does this crisis and all those like it that came before it have in common? Each was preceded by a fairly rapid and massive expansion of the supply of money and credit. But this proves nothing in and of itself. How could this expansion of the money supply cause a depression? Second, we must demonstrate how expansion of the money supply causes recessions. And third, we must show who and what was responsible for the monetary expansion. This will lead us to the real culprit, the little man behind the curtain. Before we look at inflation and who is responsible for it, we look at money. In 1929, the United States was on the gold standard. This means that the US dollar was defined by law as a specific amount of gold. Actually, prior to 1933, the United States was on a bimetallic standard. The dollar was defined as either 1/20th of an ounce of gold or roughly 1 ounce of silver. A $20 gold coin thus contained 1 ounce of pure gold. A silver dollar contained 1 ounce of silver. These precious metals were relatively scarce or rare, and therefore the money supply could not be easily manipulated or expanded under the gold standard. A major discovery of new gold or silver could potentially expand the money supply, but the actual expansion could only take place after the gold or silver was mined from the earth and refined into coins and bars, suitable for exchange. This would take time, and investors and entrepreneurs could anticipate and adjust for it. In and of itself, the expansion of the money supply does not produce depressions. So long as the expansion is real and reflects the availability of real resources, prices adjust smoothly to changing market conditions. Where we get into trouble is when the expansion of the money supply is not real, but fake or counterfeit. But who would have the ability to counterfeit money and get away with it? No one can create gold or silver, and fake gold and silver would probably be recognized right away and rejected by consumers. But even then, there are banks and governments. Prior to 1933, banks and governments would often issue notes redeemable on demand in gold or silver. One such gold certificate is shown at the bottom of the slide. If you look closely at the note, you'll notice there is a written promise that the bearer has a claim to $10 in gold coin. This note, and others like it, were technically not money. They were merely receipts, redeemable in money. That is, the note stood in the place of money that could be claimed by the person holding the note. The person or institution issuing such a note would have a legal and a moral obligation to hold enough gold or silver in reserve to meet the demands of those who hold their notes. For every $20 note or gold certificate in circulation, there would have to be 1 ounce of gold held in reserve somewhere to meet the valid claim that the note represented. Otherwise, the note would be a fraud or a phony. To prove the case against any suspect, one must establish 3 things: motive, opportunity, and evidence of guilt. 2 persons who had motive, opportunity, and for whom there is evidence of guilt for causing the Great Depression are New York Federal Reserve Chairman Benjamin Strong and Bank of England Governor Montague Norman. During World War I, the British went off of the gold standard in order to finance their war effort with inflated British pounds. The British government, through its government-owned Bank of England, simply printed paper notes for which it did not have gold to redeem. The American government did the same thing through its newly created Federal Reserve System. Paying the war-related expenses with phony paper notes was a lot easier than raising taxes, and because the government of England and the U.S. stood behind the powerful bankers who issued the phony notes and profited from them, they were not charged with counterfeiting, as anyone else would have been had they done the same thing. Strong and Norman, along with their respective governments, were part of a massive but legal counterfeiting operation. Following the war, the British attempted to restore the gold standard with the pound at its pre-war value, but this proved impossible. The British Bank of England did not have the gold to pay off all of its notes issued during the war, and people knew it. Investors began cashing in their paper pounds for gold, or they exchanged them for US dollars that were still at least nominally backed by gold. As a result, gold began to flow out of British banks into American banks and into the hands of British and American consumers. This run on the British pound threatened the solvency of the British banks and the stability of the British government. In order to support and protect the value of the pound, and to protect his banker friends in Britain who stood to lose everything, Strong ordered the printing of even more dollars. By devaluing the dollar and undermining the gold standard in America, Strong created the boom conditions of the 1920s that would later lead to the crash and depression of the 1930s. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you can see from this chart, the supply of dollars increased steadily throughout the 1920s, far beyond what the production of additional gold would have allowed. In an attempt to protect the inflated British pound, a legacy of World War I, the Fed inflated the US dollar. A more abundant and therefore cheaper dollar meant lower interest rates on loans and higher prices for many goods and services. Higher prices were particularly pronounced in the stock and land markets, where investors increasingly speculated with the cheap borrowed money. People simply assumed the rising price would continue forever, and no one wanted to miss what seemed like a can't-lose profit opportunity. The new money flowing into the market fueled the growth of unsustainable businesses that would later collapse when the flow of easy credit was cut off in 1929. The Fed could not continue inflating indefinitely, as this would endanger the value of the dollar. The chart here shows the dramatic increase in the money supply between 1921 and 1929. Demand deposits are bank deposits immediately accessible to consumers, such as checking accounts. Time deposits are those deposits not immediately accessible. Today, these would be certificates of deposits, or CDs. The ratio shows the amount of money the banks were obligated to pay out to customers versus the amount of money they actually had. Note that by 1929, there was only $1 in real money, or gold, for every $12.50 in deposits listed on bank balance sheets. In other words, the banks were technically insolvent or bankrupt, as they are today. But in a moment of high courtroom drama, the defense attorney for Mr. Strong and Mr. Norman jumps to his feet with an objection. Yes, we may have shown that the defendants had both motive and opportunity to inflate the dollar and the pound. We may also have shown that they did in fact inflate the dollar and the pound. But we have yet to show that these actions led to a depression in the 1930s, or how that could have happened. True enough, the mere correlation of events with one another does not prove causation. To demonstrate this, we call to the stand Professor Ludwig von Mises. Professor von Mises was an eminent economist whose pioneering work in business cycle theory demonstrated the link between monetary inflation and depressions. On the witness stand, Professor Mises points out that businesses invest in capital, such as buildings, machines, and tools, based on expected future profits. Because these profits are in the future, while the capital needed to realize them must be purchased in the present, entrepreneurs must finance their project with money not yet earned. They must either borrow someone else's savings and pay interest to the lender, or spend their own savings and forego the earning of interest from those they could have loaned the money to. If interest rates are low, indicative of an abundance of available savings, there is greater incentive to borrow, spend, and invest in future-oriented projects than if rates are high, indicating very little savings available. When the government or its central bank prints up or creates new money from nothing, it artificially lowers interest rates below where they otherwise would have been, creating the illusion of abundance. This inflation of the money supply misleads investors into believing that adequate real savings exist to profitably fund their projects. Real savings means that people are willing to forego consuming today, thus making more resources available for tomorrow's production. Real economic resources like land, labor, and capital are not being made more available by simply printing up paper notes. This explains why the boom created by inflation inevitably must lead to bust. Projects, particularly those focusing on production and profits in the distant future, are begun but cannot be finished. And those who were employed in those capital-intensive projects find themselves out of work once the error is discovered. This is what happened in the stock market crash of 1929 and in the housing market crash of 2007. These malinvestments, or bad investments, had to be liquidated in bankruptcies, and this is where we get the recession. Painful as they may be, these recessions are necessary if the economy is to make a full recovery from the inflationary boom caused by the government counterfeiting. What about those wealthy speculators, though? Don't they share some of the blame? The speculators so often blamed by history books were merely following false signals given off as a result of the central banks and the government's inflated currency. Had the banks not created all that phony money, and had the government not aided and abetted the counterfeiting by giving it the state's blessing, the speculation never would have occurred. Higher interest rates would have discouraged reckless borrowing and prevented malinvestment. The economy would have remained on a sustainable trajectory, and only projects that were within the means and real preferences of the consuming public would have been undertaken, no more and no less. No stock market boom and no stock market crash. The entire blame for the Great Depression rests not with the free market or any of its participants, but with the Federal Reserve System and the federal government that created it. But what about those earlier panics that happened before the founding of the Federal Reserve System? Well, one need not have a central bank to have monetary inflation. The existence of a central bank made it easier for the banks to coordinate their inflation, but inflation still could and did happen without it. Even before the Fed was founded, both the federal government and state governments permitted and even sometimes encouraged banks to issue paper notes for which there was no gold or silver in the vault. This was particularly true when the government needed extra funds to fight a war. Each of our nation's wars was funded one way or another by monetary inflation. Both the Revolutionary War and the War for Southern Independence, or Civil War if you prefer, were funded by unbacked government-issued paper, the Revolutionary War by the Continental, and the War for Southern Independence by Lincoln's greenbacks. Also, both the federal and state governments would often charter or license banks to operate within the state on the condition that the banks purchased the government's bonds or IOUs. These bonds would then be considered as legal reserves to back up bank-issued notes and demand deposits, just as if these government-issued IOUs were gold or silver. If customers demanded gold or silver, the government would often back the banks and permit the banks to deny or suspend payment to their customers. Influential bankers quickly learned that if they were big enough and had enough friends in the high places, the government had their backs. Panics, depressions, and recessions, or whatever you might choose to call them, do not just happen spontaneously. They have a root cause, and that cause is inflation. The inflation of the money supply by the government and its allied banks causes an unsustainable investment boom that eventually collapses into recession. As with an alcoholic or on a drinking binge, the boom may feel good for a while, creating the illusion of prosperity, but it always ends the same way, with a hangover. The way to prevent a hangover is not to drink, and the way to prevent a recession is not to inflate. The Great Depression of the 1930s and early 40s was not unique in its causes. What was unique was the government response to it. It is this response that intensified and prolonged the recession for more than a decade and made it great. Episode 2 of this presentation will examine that response.